Straits of Hormuz are this choke point in the Persian Gulf. 20% of the world's oil passes through there. And right now you've got ships essentially parked on either side of the strait. The ones trying to leave saying, I'm not going to go through there just yet. One tanker was hit and was set on.
Oil didn't just spike. It detonated into a global crisis as Iran shut down Hormuz, choking off nearly a fifth of the world's supply overnight. Prices surged past $120 and nations scrambled in panic. But while Trump pushed a $126 oil narrative, one country quietly bypassed the chaos. Canada's Pacific route kept flowing, turning isolation into power when the world needed it most.
Tonight, day one of the Liberals' majority government.
Voters placed their trust in Canada's new government's plan. We accept their support with humility.
This Prime Minister has manufactured a costly majority that Canadians rejected in the last election.
3 decisive by-election victories and 5 floor crossers later, Prime Minister Mark Carney's Liberal government has itself crossed the threshold into majority territory.
The Strait of Hormuz is deceptively small, only 33 to 54 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. But what flows through that corridor is not marginal. Approximately 20 million barrels of oil transited every single day under normal conditions. Nearly 80% of that volume is bound for Asian markets. The Strait is the primary export route for Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates simultaneously. When Iran's closure severed that corridor following escalating military strikes, the disruption immediately exceeded the scale of the 1970s oil embargo in terms of volume removed from the market. And unlike the 1970s, there was no meaningful alternative waiting in the background. Saudi Arabia and the UAE both operate pipelines that can bypass the strait. The problem is capacity. Those pipeline routes can handle less than 30% of the volume that normally moves through Hormuz. The gap between what the world needed and what could be rerouted through land-based alternatives is where the crisis genuinely took shape. Storage systems filled rapidly. Production began slowing because there was nowhere to put the output. Iraq provided the clearest illustration of the bottleneck without strait access. Its ability to export crude essentially collapsed, forcing production cuts not because demand had fallen, but because physical storage ran out. Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar faced the same structural constraint. The closure was not a localized disruption to one producer. It was a systemic shock across every major exporting economy in the region. Natural gas markets absorbed an equally severe impact. Qatar is one of the largest LNG exporters in the world and routes virtually all of its shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. When those flows stopped, there was no meaningful rerouting option. Regions that depend on Qatari LNG faced an immediate choice between finding replacement supply at any available price or dramatically reducing consumption. Across Asia, governments began implementing emergency energy conservation measures. Prices for available LNG cargoes moved to levels that would have been dismissed as hypothetical months earlier. China, Japan, South Korea, and India found themselves competing for the same limited supply that could still be delivered without transiting the conflict zone. This is where Canadian geography stopped being a background fact and became a front-page advantage. Oil moving through Canada's export infrastructure does not pass through any equivalent choke point. It does not transit narrow corridors controlled by rival powers. It does not depend on shipping routes that can be targeted, mined, or extorted. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which reached full operational capacity in 2024 at approximately 890,000 barrels per day, routes Alberta crude directly to British Columbia's Pacific coast. From there, tankers cross open ocean toward Asian markets, thousands of kilometers removed from the Persian Gulf conflict zone, outside the range of any regional missile or drone system, and entirely independent of the geopolitical dynamics that had paralyzed Middle Eastern exports. The distance is not merely a comfort, it is structural protection. The physical separation between Canada's Pacific export terminals and the Middle East makes it physically impossible for the kind of disruption unfolding in the Gulf to reach Canadian shipping. No insurance cancellation forced by missile risk. No transit fee extortion at a controlled waterway. No government announcement that the route might close based on negotiations happening in a city thousands of kilometers away. Shippers and buyers understood this distinction immediately when it became operationally critical rather than merely theoretical. Asian refineries understood it too, and many of them were already positioned to act on it. China has invested heavily in large-scale refining complexes specifically designed to process heavy crude, the exact type Alberta produces. When traditional Gulf supply became inaccessible, Chinese buyers did not need to reconfigure their infrastructure to accept Canadian crude. The match already existed. India and South Korea maintained similar technical compatibility. These countries were not starting from zero when they began seeking alternatives. They were accelerating a pivot toward a supplier they already understood, whose product their refineries could already process, and whose export route carried none of the vulnerabilities that had just shut down their primary supply chain. The LNG dimension of this shift carries even longer structural implications. LNG Canada, the export facility in British Columbia, routes liquefied natural gas directly across the North Pacific toward Asian markets. That route avoids the Strait of Hormuz entirely. It also avoids the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and every other high-risk transit corridor that has historically introduced uncertainty and cost into energy supply chains. Shorter distance, lower exposure to geopolitical disruption, and no war risk insurance premium. In a normal market, these factors produce modest advantages. In a crisis where the alternative route is actively controlled by a hostile military power, they become the primary factors determining which supplier can deliver and which cannot. Long-term contract discussions in energy markets are shaped heavily by crisis experience. When a country discovers that 40 to 45% of its crude imports depend on a single corridor that can be closed at another government's decision, the appetite for diversification intensifies in ways that outlast the immediate crisis. Japan and South Korea rely on the Strait of Hormuz for approximately 70% of their oil supply. Having just experienced what that dependency costs when the corridor becomes a war zone, their procurement strategies for the next decade will reflect a significantly higher premium on supply sources that are geographically insulated from equivalent disruption. Canadian Pacific exports provide exactly that insulation. The geopolitical dimension intersects with the commercial one in a way that reshapes the strategic relationship between Canada and the United States. The Trump administration has consistently sought to maintain Canadian energy exports within North American infrastructure, keeping them tied to American markets and pricing systems. The Trans Mountain expansion changed that dynamic before the Hormuz crisis. The crisis accelerated the change. Canadian producers now have operational access to Asian markets that do not require American intermediation. And those markets facing an acute supply emergency demonstrated their willingness to pay a significant premium for reliable delivery from a stable jurisdiction with no equivalent vulnerability. If even a portion of Asian demand for oil and gas structurally shifts towards suppliers whose export routes are independent of Middle Eastern conflict zones, the volume involved is large enough to reshape global pricing dynamics for years. Canada does not need to replace Middle Eastern exports entirely to benefit from this repositioning. Reducing dependence carries value in energy markets that is often greater than increasing volume. A country that can supply reliably when others cannot commands a premium that compounds over time into infrastructure, investment, long-term contracts, and strategic partnerships. Projects proposed for the next phase of LNG development along Canada's Pacific coast, including facilities that could push total Canadian LNG export capacity past 40 million tons per year by the early 2030s, are now being evaluated against a demand picture that the 2026 crisis permanently altered. Countries that watch their energy systems come under acute pressure due to reliance on a single vulnerable route are not going to ignore that experience when committing to the next decade of supply contracts. The Strait may reopen, ceasefires can hold, prices can stabilize, but the structural lesson embedded in the 2026 crisis is not temporary. The capability to close the Strait of Hormuz still exists after any ceasefire. The underlying vulnerability does not disappear because the immediate disruption ends. And every government that watched its energy system strain under that vulnerability is now carrying the memory of what it cost directly into its next procurement decision.